Hey everyone, and welcome to another deep dive. If you're prepping for the UPSC, especially that international relations paper,
You know Marx's theory is going to come up.
it always does.
And there's one concept that just seems to trip people up.
The dictatorship of the proletariat.
Yeah, that's the one.
Sounds kind of scary, right?
Well, it definitely sparked a lot of debate.
And revolutions.
Exactly. So we're going deep on this one, folks.
We've got Marx, Engels, Lenin.
Even some critics who really push back against this idea.
So let's get started.
That was good.
Our journey begins with Marx's critique of the Gotha program. What's the backdrop here?
Well, picture this. It's the 1870s,
Okay.
and you've got Marx caught in this ideological tug of war.
Between
The anarchists who want to smash the state, like right now,
get rid of it completely.
and the social democrats who think they can, work within the system to bring about socialism.
I can see why Marx might be a bit frustrated.
Oh, he was. He thought both groups were totally missing the mark.
So what does he propose?
He lays out this two-phase transition to communism.
Two phases.
Yeah. So first you've got the lower phase,
Which
the
is?
dictatorship of the proletariat.
Okay, there it is.
Think of it as this in-between stage, capitalism and full-blown communism.
Like a bridge.
Exactly. It's born out of revolution, but it still has some leftover bits from the old order.
Like what?
Well, in this phase, people are still rewarded based on how much they work.
To each according to his contribution.
Right. You got it. But this phase, it's not the end goal.
There's more.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Then comes the higher phase, the communist utopia.
Sounds dreamy.
It's where things get really interesting. This is a society of abundance.
Abundance of what?
Everything. Resources, goods, you name it. The guiding principle here is from each according to his ability to each according to his needs.
Wow, no more scarcity?
No more class struggle, no more private property. It's the ultimate goal.
But hold on, how do you actually get from this dictatorship to that utopia?
That's the million-dollar question, and it's where Marx gets a bit fuzzy on the details.
Fuzzy how?
Well, he doesn't really spell out how you dismantle the state without creating chaos.
Or how you motivate people to contribute when material incentives are gone.
Right. It's a recipe for debate and misinterpretations.
And probably a lot of power struggles.
You got it.
So even before we get to the transition, there are some big question marks around this whole dictatorship thing.
Absolutely. How is it supposed to actually function?
Yeah. What does it look like in practice?
Well, this is where Engels' idea of the withering away of the state comes in.
Withering away.
Yeah, the idea is that the state gradually shifts from governing people,
Right.
managing things, ensuring everyone's basic needs are met.
So starts out strong, but then slowly fades into the background.
Precisely. And that's where things get even more tricky.
How so?
Because how do you have centralized planning and individual freedom at the same time?
It seems like you'd need some kind of control to make sure everyone gets what they need.
Right. But too much control can stifle individual liberty.
A classic dilemma.
And Marx and Engels weren't exactly clear on how to strike that balance.
So already we're seeing some cracks in the foundation.
Definitely. And those cracks led to some pretty big splits within the socialist movement itself.
Like what?
Well, take revisionism, for example.
Right.
Thinkers like Edward Bernstein.
What did they believe?
They basically rejected the whole dictatorship of the proletariat idea as barbaric.
Too harsh.
They thought so. They advocated for democratic socialism instead.
So working within the existing system to bring about gradual change?
Exactly, through things like elections and reforms.
So even among socialists, there was disagreement on the best way to achieve Marx's vision.
Big time. And for anyone studying international relations,
Especially for the UPSC.
understanding these nuances and critiques is super important.
I'm already seeing how this concept is way more complex than I initially thought.
It's not just a definition, it's a historical force with all sorts of baggage.
And we've only scratched the surface.
We haven't even gotten to the Russian Revolution yet.
Where things I imagine get even messier.
Oh yeah, buckle up, because that's where we're headed next.
But before we do that, let's do a quick recap for our listeners. We started with Marx's critique of the Gotha program,
Which outlines his idea of a two-phase transition to communism.
including this controversial concept of the dictatorship of the proletariat,
We talked about those inherent ambiguities within Marx's theory,
like the unclear transition between phases.
then the tension between centralized planning and individual freedom.
And we saw how those ambiguities led to different interpretations within the socialist movement itself.
Like the emergence of revisionism as an alternative path.
Now we're about to see how these theoretical debates played out in the real world.
When Lenin and the Bolsheviks took power in Russia.
This is where Marxist theory meets revolutionary practice.
And the results, as we'll see, are far from straightforward.
So stay tuned, folks. The Russian Revolution awaits.
It's going to be a wild ride. Welcome back, everyone. So before the break, we're really getting into Marxist theory of the state.
Specifically that whole dictatorship of the proletariat thing.
Right, this idea that it's just a temporary phase on the road to full-blown communism.
A stepping stone to that utopian society.
Exactly. But as we saw with those 20th century communist experiments, things didn't exactly go according to plan.
Yeah, the Soviet Union, for example.
It ended up looking very different from what Marx originally envisioned.
So what went wrong?
Well, a lot of factors were at play. Of course, Russia's historical context was unique.
It wasn't exactly the industrialized nation Marx had in mind.
Right, but even beyond that, there were some inherent ambiguities within Marx's ideas themselves.
So it wasn't a foolproof blueprint.
Not exactly. There was room for interpretation, and let's be honest, misinterpretation too.
And that's where those critiques start to come in, right?
Exactly, like the work of Robert Dahl.
Okay, I've heard that name. What were some of his main points?
Well, one of his big critiques was that Marxism kind of assumes this harmony and unity in a socialist society.
Everyone working together towards a common goal.
Right. But Dahl argued that democratic thought acknowledges that people will always have different interests.
Different wants and needs.
Exactly. And a healthy democracy allows for those differences to be expressed and negotiated.
That makes sense. Trying to force everyone into the same mold seems kind of unrealistic.
Exactly. And Dahl also pointed out that Marx wasn't very clear on how power would be distributed in a socialist society.
Like who gets to make decisions?
Exactly. And how are those decisions made?
It's pretty important detail to leave out.
Yeah, and remember, Marx was writing in the context of 19th century bourgeois states.
So he saw the state as a tool of oppression used by the wealthy to exploit the working class.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But the rise of democracy and universal suffrage kind of complicated that picture.
Because if workers could potentially gain control of the state through elections.
The need for a violent revolution becomes less clear.
Right. It's a whole different ballgame.
And that leads us to another major critique. The lack of attention to individual rights and freedoms in Marx at work.
He seemed to prioritize the collective over the individual.
To some extent, yeah. And he didn't seem to fully grasp the potential of democracy to bring about change peacefully.
Ironic, isn't it? He's fighting for liberation, but not necessarily individual liberty.
It's a valid point.
Yeah.
And on top of all that, his emphasis on class struggle as the driving force of history.
Which is like a core concept in Marxism.
It starts to feel less relevant in today's world.
Especially in those advanced economies where class lines have become blurrier.
Right. So we're seeing some serious cracks in the foundation of Marx's theory of the state.
But what about what actually happened in those so-called communist states?
Did they even come close to achieving Marx's vision?
That's the big question.
And sadly, the answer is not really thinkers like Milovan-Gelius.
Who wrote The New Class?
Exactly. He argued that communist societies often just created new forms of class privilege.
So instead of abolishing class, they just replace one elite with another.
Pretty much. And then you have George Orwell.
Animal Farm and 1984.
Those chilling portrayals of totalitarian regimes really capture the tragic irony of revolutions gone wrong.
Revolutions meant to liberate the masses, ending up creating new forms of oppression.
It's a sobering thought, and it brings us back to that central question.
Was the dictatorship of the proletariat a necessary evil on the path to a just society?
Or was it inherently flawed from the start?
These are the kinds of questions UPSC examiners love to throw at you.
Absolutely. And I think we've laid a good foundation for tackling those questions.
We've explored Marx's theory, highlighted the ambiguities, and examined how those ambiguities played out in practice.
Exactly. But we're not done yet.
There's more.
Oh, yeah. We still need to explore what, if anything, can be salvaged from this idea of the dictatorship of the proletariat.
Can it be reformed?
Are there safeguards to prevent it from slipping into authoritarianism?
These are important questions.
And we'll try to answer them when we continue this deep dive after the break.
Welcome back to the deep dive, everyone. We've been going deep on this idea of the dictatorship of the proletariat.
A concept that's caused a lot of controversy.
And rightfully so. Marx saw it as this temporary phase.
A necessary evil, maybe.
On the road to true communist utopia.
But as we've seen, those historical examples haven't exactly been inspiring.
Yeah, it seems like power corrupts even those who claim to be fighting for the people.
Absolutely. Didn't Marx himself warn about the dangers of bureaucracy?
He did. And this is where those anarchist critiques become really relevant.
Thinkers like Bakunin.
They were deeply skeptical of any form of state power.
Even if it was supposed to be temporary.
They feared it would inevitably lead to oppression.
And looking back at the 20th century, it's hard to disagree with them.
So are we saying Marx's vision is inherently flawed?
That the dictatorship of the proletariat is doomed to fail.
These are tough questions,
And honestly, there are no easy answers.
especially for those of you prepping for the UPSC.
The key is to understand the nuances of the debate.
The different perspectives and the historical context.
It's not about finding the right answer.
It's about demonstrating a sophisticated understanding of how complex this all really is.
Exactly. So let's break down some key takeaways for our listeners.
Perfect, because I know those IR questions can be tricky.
First, remember that the dictatorship of the proletariat isn't a monolithic concept.
Meaning what?
It's been interpreted and implemented in very different ways.
Some closer to Marx's original vision than others.
Exactly. So understanding those differences and their consequences is crucial.
Got it. Context is everything.
Second, be prepared to critically assess the strengths and weaknesses of the concept.
So think about it from both sides.
Exactly. What are the potential benefits of a strong revolutionary state in overseeing that transition?
And what are the risks?
What could go wrong?
UPSC examiners want to see that you can weigh both sides of the argument.
Absolutely. And finally, don't lose sight of the bigger picture.
How does this all fit into Marx's broader theory of history?
Exactly. How does it relate to concepts like class struggle, revolution, and the eventual withering away of the state?
Being able to connect the dots is what makes your answers stand out.
It shows a deeper level of understanding.
So understand the nuances, analyze the concept, and connect it back to the grand scheme of Marxist thought.
Those are the keys to success.
I feel much more prepared to tackle those UPSC questions now.
And to leave you with something to ponder.
Oh, I love these final thought-provoking questions.
If this dictatorship of the proletariat is truly meant to be temporary,
What mechanisms or safeguards could actually ensure a smooth transition to that classless, stateless society?
how do you prevent new forms of power and inequality from emerging?
That's a great question. It's something to really think about as you continue your UPSC journey.
Absolutely.
And for all of you future diplomats out there, if you found this deep dive helpful,
Hit that like button and subscribe for more UPSC-focused content.
we'll be back with more insights to help you ace that exam.
Until next time, happy studying.